Picture this. It is Friday morning and a pot has been simmering on your stove since before fajr. The window has fogged at the edge. The kitchen smells of slow-cooked broth and warmth, and in your own body you know exactly what I am about to talk about. The slow ache rising from sujood. The hand that braces on the wall when you stand from the prayer mat. The knees that no longer move the way they did when you were 30. There are 15 Sunnah foods the great Tibb scholars catalogued for over 1,000 years for the joints and the knees of those whose bodies have begun to slow, ending with the one your grandmother knew, but the modern kitchen has forgotten. Today, on Sunnah Gardens, we will name each one. Bismillah, let us begin. A quick word before we begin. We have gathered the daily practices of the beloved, peace be upon him, how his household ate, drank, slept, and healed, into one book, the Sunnah Home Manual. 40 practices, every hadith verified, every source shown. To get your copy, visit sunnahgardens.com. Or pause this video right now, open the camera on your phone, point it at the code on your screen, and tap the link that appears. You will also find the link in the description right below this video. I will not mention it again. If you want it, it is there. Now, let's begin. Begin in the deep winter Madinan kitchen with the cut that anchored the long simmered stews of the Sahaba's coldest months. Sak al-Baytar, the lower leg of the cow, with the bone left in and the meat slow cooked around it until it falls from the bone at the touch of a spoon. Every part of a halal slaughtered cow is lawful under the Sahih general halal livestock permission. Ibn Sina, in the canon of medicine, named the shin specifically as warming, strengthening, and recommended for those with weakness in the limbs. The lower leg, where the muscle meets the bone in the running animal, carries a different kind of warmth than any other cut on the body. The combination of muscle, sinew, and bone marrow makes the shin one of the most concentrated, collagen-rich preparations in the classical Arab kitchen. The Madinan households simmered it overnight in the winter and ate it in the morning with bread torn into the broth. The grandmother would put the pot on the fire after Isha. In the morning, after fajr, the family would eat the meat from the broken bone with the bread softened in the broth. The first meal of the cold day, the warmth of the shin reaching the joints before the work of the day began. This is not a clarified bone broth. This is the bone in shin cut, eaten as the meat itself, slow cooked with onions, cumin, and a touch of saffron, the way the Sahaba kitchen prepared it. From the cow, move to the goat, the everyday halal livestock meat across the Hejaz, Yemen, and the broader Arab world. More accessible than lamb, more common than beef, the goat was on the table of nearly every Madinan household, and the cut prized for slow simmering was the shank, sak al-ma'iz, the lower leg with the bone left in. Ibn al-Baytar, in his great al-Jami, catalogued goat shank as lighter on the body than lamb shank, with the same strengthening character, recommended for those whose digestion was weak but who still needed the collagen warmth of the bone-in cut. The goat, in its constant climbing across rocky ground, builds a lower leg meat leaner and easier on the constitution than the heavier lamb. In many Madinan households, goat shank was the Friday meal cut, simmered overnight Thursday into the post-Jumu'ah meal. The grandmother would begin it at the Maghrib Adhan on Thursday evening. By the time the family returned from Jumu'ah, the meat had fallen from the bone, the broth had darkened into amber, and the kitchen carried the scent of cumin, onion, and patient cooking, slow cooked in a small clay pot, the bone giving its warmth to the broth. Now to the most prestigious of the slow-cooked joint preparations of the Sahaba kitchen, the lamb shank, Mauza al-Dan. This was the cut served on wedding, brought to honored guests, prepared when the meal needed to carry the weight of hospitality. Ibn Sina, in the canon, singled it out by name. The lower leg of the lamb, simmered long, he wrote, is the most strengthening of the simmered preparations for those with weakness in the joints and the back. He placed it specifically above above the upper leg cuts in his ranking of the warming foods for the elderly, noting that the bone in lower leg yields a broth no roasted cut can match. Lamb shank with saffron rice and Madinan herbs is documented across the early sources as a Sahaba-era guest meal. And this is not the lamb shoulder of the Eid roast. The shoulder is the upper foreleg, dry roasted. The shank is the lower leg, slow simmered in broth until the meat falls from the visible bone. A different cut, a different method, and a different food for the joints, ranked by the Tibb scholars above almost every other simmered preparation. Now to one of the most ancient documented preparations in the classical Arab kitchen, goat trotters. Akare al-Ma'iz. The feet themselves cleaned and slow simmered through the night until the broth turns dark amber and the cartilage releases its strength into the pot. Ibn al-Baytar documented goat trotters in al-Jami as the warmest and the most strengthening of the simmered limb preparations for the joints. Slow on the fire, he wrote, eaten with bread for the strength it gives to the lower limb. He named the trotter as the food the household kept for the body that had begun to feel the years in the legs and the knees. Across Hejaz and Yemen, trotter broth was the morning preparation for those returning from long journeys. The traveler arrived stiff and tired from the road. The household put trotter broth on the fire before the traveler woke, and by morning the broth was ready, eaten before any other food reached the table. This was the welcome of the stiff body home. This is not the Eid roasted sheep's foot. It is the slow simmered Sahaba kitchen preparation, eaten in broth form on cold mornings, named by Ibn al-Baytar among the deepest of the simmered foods for the limbs. Move now to the kitchen of a Medinan household with access to beef, to the cut at the very end of the cow, the tail, Dial al-Baqar. Every part of a halal slaughtered cow is lawful, including the tail. Ibn al-Baytar noted the tail of the cow specifically as rich with the same warming character as the shin and the trotter, with the bones giving a thicker broth than any other cut. The small, dense bones of the tail, packed close together along the spine, release more of their strength into the broth than the larger long bones do. The slow simmer reduces the tail broth into the thickest, glossiest preparation the animal yields. Oxtail stew was the cold month preparation in those Medinan households that had access to beef. Slow simmered through the night with onions, barley, and salt, eaten in the morning when the cold was at its sharpest. The grandmother set it on the fire after Isha, banking the coals low, and the simmer ran through the long winter night without her tending it again until before fajr. The bones of the tail are dense and small, and the slow simmer releases everything in them into the broth, a thicker, glossier, more concentrated stew than the shin or the shank yield. This was the preparation reserved for the deep weeks of the cold. Now to the most cartilage-rich cut of the entire lamb, the knuckle, rush al-dan. The joint itself, between the shin and the trotter, where the cartilage gathers densely at the bone's end. Ibn al-Qayyim in Zad al-Ma'ad mentioned the knuckle joints of halal livestock, specifically as the seat of strength in the limb, and recommended their slow-cooked preparation for those whose mobility was beginning to weaken with age. The cartilage at the bone's end carries a particular medicine for the cartilage at the bone's end of the one who eats it. A Tibb principle the early Muslim scholars returned to again and again. This is the cut your grandmother would have known by its feel in the pot, the cut that requires the longest simmer of any of the joint preparations, because the cartilage at the bone's end only releases its strength after hours of slow cooking. The Sahaba-era household kept the knuckle in the smaller pot at the side of the fire while the main meal cooked above the flame, the knuckle simmering low and slow through the entire afternoon. Different from the shank. The shank is the entire lower leg. The knuckle is the joint specifically, named by name in the Tibb canon, prepared with care in a small clay pot, low on the fire. A quick reminder before we go further. At number 1, I will name the preparation the great Tibb scholars ranked above every other broth for the joints. The food the Sahaba kept on the fire from before fajr to the morning meal. Stay with me. Now, number 9, goat neck. Rakaba al-Maiz, the dense cluster of small bones running through the neck of the goat with the connective tissue between them, slow simmered into one of the strongest broths in the classical Arab kitchen. Ibn al-Baytar documented goat neck specifically as one of the most economical and strengthening cuts of the goat. The bones close together, the meat between them yielding a strong broth. The neck, where the animal carries the weight of the head through every motion of grazing and climbing, builds a connective tissue denser and richer than any other part of the body. In many Sahaba-era households, when the larger cuts went to guests or to the market, the neck stayed for the family. The strong broth no guest would see, eaten in the quiet of the evening meal, slow simmered through the long afternoon, the bones giving everything they had to the pot, the broth darkening as the hours passed. Now to the cartilage running along the ribs and the breastbone of the halal lamb, what the Tibb scholars called gadarif al-adla, one of the densest concentrated connective tissue parts of the entire animal. Ibn Sina, in the canon, mentioned the cartilage parts, gadarif, as moist, warming, and strengthening for the connective parts of the body when slow simmered. He distinguished sharply between the muscle of the rib and the cartilage at the end of the rib, naming the cartilage as the part of the lamb that fed the connective tissue of the one who ate it. Across the Sahaba kitchen, ribs simmered down until the meat fell from the bone and the cartilage at the end of each rib turned tender enough to eat. The mother of the household would simmer it through the afternoon, and by the evening meal, the cartilage had softened into something both rich and gently chewy. The children would eat the meat. The elders would take the cartilage. This was the unspoken arrangement of the Sahaba-era family table, the cartilage parts given to the joints that needed them most. The Tibb tradition named the cartilage specifically, not the muscle of the rib, but the connective tissue at its end, as the part of the lamb that fed the joints. Cross now from the lamb to the camel, to a preparation that defined the Bedouin Sahaba kitchen on the longest journeys. Camel sinew, asab al-jamal, the tendons of the halal camel, slow simmered into a tough, dense, deeply strengthening food for the long desert march. Ibn Sina, in the canon, documented camel sinew specifically as drying, warming, and strengthening for the legs and the back, recommended for those who needed sustained physical endurance. He named it as a food for the body that would walk and walk again the next day, suiting the constitution of the traveler more than almost any other simmered preparation. The Bedouin households slow-simmered camel sinew for 2 full days before military campaigns. The grandmother began the pot 2 evenings before the men departed, and the simmer ran continuously until the morning they loaded their saddlebags and rode out. The Sahaba carried it across the Arabian Peninsula on the way to Khaybar, on the way to Tabuk, on every long campaign of the early Muslim world. This is distinct from the camel meat itself and from the hump fat. The sinew is the tendon strip specifically, and the Tibb scholars singled it out for the joints. Back now to the kitchen with beef on the fire, to the knuckle joints of the cow, rusk al-Bakar. Ibn al-Baytar noted beef knuckle as heavier on the digestion than the lamb knuckle, but stronger in the broth, and recommended for those whose constitutions tolerate the warmer cuts. The classical Tibb tradition was specific about the difference between lamb knuckle and beef knuckle. The lamb is lighter, gentler, suited to weaker digestion. The beef is heavier, deeper, suited to the stronger constitution. Both feed the joints, the Tibb scholars wrote, but each was prescribed for a different body and a different season. Ibn al-Qayyim, drawing on the same canon, wrote that the elder with the strong constitution should take the beef knuckle in the depth of winter, and the elder with the weaker digestion should take the lamb knuckle in the milder months. Slow simmered with onions and a touch of cinnamon, the beef knuckle becomes a deep jellied reduction broth, eaten in the cold of winter when the body needs the warmer cut, when the joints feel the cold the most. Now to the most extraordinary cold preparation in this entire lineup, Patcha, the gelled, cold-set jelly of halal trotters, reduced through long simmering and then chilled until the broth itself sets into a clear amber jelly. Eaten across the Muslim world for over 1,000 years, from Yemen up through Iraq, through the Caucasus, into Central Asia, into the kitchens of Pakistani and North Indian Muslim households who still know it by name today. al-Qayyim in Zad al-Ma'ad documented the gelled broth preparations of halal livestock parts as concentrated strength for the joints, taken at the cold of the morning to warm the limbs into the day. The Tibb scholars long observed a curious paradox that the cold jelly, eaten chilled, warms the body more deeply than the warm broth eaten hot, because the long reduction concentrates the strength of the bone and cartilage in a way no warm preparation can match. This is distinct from the warm, simmered trotters. Patcha is the cold reduction, set into a jelly, eaten chilled at the start of the morning. A different food in form, the same source in origin, named by the Tibb scholars specifically for the joints. The Caucasus Muslim grandmother set the patcha to chill on the cold stone of the pantry overnight, and the family ate it at dawn, before any other food of the day. Return now to the lamb, to the breast cut, the brisket, sadr al-dan, rich in connective tissue, suited above all other cuts to the slow simmering method. This was a Sahaba-era hospitality preparation, particularly across the Hijaz. Ibn Sina, in the canon, singled out the breast region, sadr, of halal livestock as moistening and strengthening for the chest and the connective parts of the body. The brisket, where the layers of fat and muscle and connective tissue interweave across the breastbone, carries a deeper moistening warmth than the leaner cuts of the back and the shoulder yield. The Madinan households of means prepared slow simmered brisket with onions and saffron rice as the guest meal, placed on the table when honored guests arrived, served from the wide dish with the meat falling apart at its edges. The grandmother would have begun the slow simmer the night before. The hospitality of the household lived in this cut. The brisket is not the shoulder. The shoulder is the upper foreleg, suited to dry roasting. The brisket is the breast, the connective tissue-rich cut that only the long simmer can render down, named in the Tibb tradition for the connective parts of the body. And now to the only seafood in this lineup, and an honest note about how it is anchored, the sea cucumber, khiyar al-bahr. Allah says in Surah Al-Ma'idah, verse 96, "Lawful for you is what you catch from the sea, and its food as provision for you and for travelers." The verse opens halal seafood beyond fish to include the broader catalogue of sea creatures the Sahaba caught. Sea cucumber is not named in a specific Sahih Hadith, and I want to be transparent about that, but the Quranic permission of all sea catch covers it directly. And the classical Tibb literature of the Indian Ocean Muslim world, particularly the Yemeni and Hadrami coastal traditions, documented sea cucumber preparations as one of the most concentrated marine sources for joint and connective tissue strengthening. The Hadrami scholars wrote that the creature, made almost entirely of soft connective material, carries a marine version of the same strengthening character as the cartilage of the limb. Sun-dried sea cucumber was a Hadrami pilgrim provision for the long journey to the holy cities, carried in a small cloth at the bottom of the saddlebag, reconstituted in warm water on the long mornings of the road. The sea creature the Quran permitted under the broader catch, and the Tibb scholars catalogued by name. Now to the longest simmered preparation in the entire halal meat tradition, the foot of the halal camel. Khuf al-Jamal, distinct from the camel meat, distinct from the hump fat, distinct from the sinew. The foot itself, slow simmered over the longest cooking time of any halal meat preparation the Bedouin Sahaba kitchen knew. Ibn al-Baytar documented camel foot as the strongest of the simmered limb preparations for those whose joints need the deepest restoration. The foot of the animal that walked the longest miles, he wrote, becomes the food that restores the foot of the man who has walked the longest miles. The Sahaba on the longest Hajj caravans documented the preparation in the resting halts. Camel foot stew was the rest day preparation, slow simmered through a full day's rest. The caravan halted at a watering oasis. The fire was built in the morning. The pot simmered through the entire midday and afternoon. And at the evening meal before the next leg of the march began, the men ate the camel foot broth together. Where the lamb shank yields its strength in hours, the camel foot yields its strength in a full day on the fire. And the Tibb scholars wrote that the broth that results carries the deepest restoration the simmered tradition can give to the joints. And now, at number 1, the preparation the great Tibb scholars ranked above every other broth for the joints. Marak asab al-dan, the slow simmered halal, lamb tendon, and cartilage joint broth that the Sahaba kept on the fire from before fajr until the morning meal. Let me be open with you about the anchor. This is not a single Sahih Hadith naming this exact preparation by name. It is the Sahaba kitchen practice the Tibb scholars catalogued specifically across 1,000 years. Ibn Sina in the canon placed tendon broths in the highest category of strengthening foods for the limbs of the elderly. He wrote that the tendon, the cord of strength that connects the muscle to the bone, when slow simmered into broth, carries a medicine for the same cord of strength in the one who eats it. Ibn al-Qayyim, drawing on the Sahaba kitchen practice in Zad al-Ma'ad, wrote that the long-simmered preparations of tendon and cartilage were the food that returns strength to the joints when the strength has begun to leave them. And Ibn al-Baytar in al-Jami described the slow-simmered tendon broth as the warmest and the most strengthening of the simmered preparations, placing it above shank, above trotter, above brisket in the classical Tibb ranking. The Bedouin Sahaba kitchen kept a tendon and cartilage broth simmering through the long, cold nights, particularly in the colder months and on the rest days between campaigns. The grandmother set the pot before Isha. The grandfather tended the fire once in the night. And the elders of the household, those whose joints had begun to feel the long walking of the Arabian travels, ate the broth in the morning before any other food of the day. Every preparation in this list leads to this one. The shank carries the bone and meat. The knuckle carries the cartilage. The trotter carries the gelatin. The brisket carries the connective fat. Tendon broth carries all of them at once, and the Tibb scholars named it as the deepest food for the joints in the entire classical Arab kitchen. Slow simmered through the night with halal lamb tendons, the joint cartilage, onions, salt, a touch of saffron, eaten in the morning with bread torn into the warm broth, the way the Sahaba ate it through the cold months, and the way our grandmothers knew, but the modern kitchen has forgotten. That was our countdown of the 15 Sunnah foods that strengthen your joints and your knees. For over 1,000 years, the great Tibb scholars, Ibn Sina, Ibn al-Qayyim, Ibn al-Baytar, catalogued the slow-simmered joint preparations of the Sahaba kitchen by name for exactly the complaint so many of us carry now. The Sunnah holds the Sahih general halal livestock permission. The Tibb scholars held the joint-specific knowledge. The modern Tier 1 Muslim diaspora has, in 1 or 2 generations, lost much of the kitchen practice that carried it. These are means Allah created, not magic. Warming preparations the scholars of our tradition wrote down for those whose joints have begun to slow. May Allah grant you and your family complete shifa. If your grandmother prepared any of these, share the name in the comments. And in our next video, we will be opening the forgotten Sunnah preparations the Sahaba ate for restful sleep, the foods that closed the day across every Muslim culture for 1,000 years. Bismillah. Until then.